How much do we know about Native American history? For many of us, Native American culture, history, and people are often summed up in a few stereotypes or limited to a few lines in history books. We're taught about Thanksgiving and Pocahontas, about cowboys and Indians, and maybe mention some battles here and there. But this version of history needs to include a lot. What if I told you that most of what we learn in school barely scratches the surface? Native American history offers an entire world of knowledge, and that's rarely taught. So, in this video, we're going deeper, uncovering the untold truths and stories of Native Americans that your history teacher probably didn't tell you in class. Let's start with, we all know Christopher Columbus's story. Lost but determined, the brave explorer stumbles upon a new world. Oh yeah, all that stuff. But let's clarify. America wasn't discovered. It was already thriving. By the time Europeans arrived, millions lived here with civilizations that had developed independently for thousands of years. Think about the Taino people in the Caribbean, who were among the first Native Americans to encounter Columbus. They had a structured society, advanced farming techniques, and even a peaceful philosophy called Guanine, emphasizing balance and respect. But rather than being seen as equals, they were dismissed, enslaved, or unlived. The Taino and many others were not primitive or inferior. They were simply different, yet their cultures and knowledge were systematically erased in favor of European dominance. Our textbooks rarely acknowledge this perspective, glossing over the violent impact of European arrival on indigenous populations. We were often taught that Native Americans welcomed Europeans. This convenient myth overlooks the reality of colonization, displacement, and cultural erasure. In reality, many Native communities faced brutal treatment, including forced removals and massacres, as European settlers claimed more and more land. Long before Columbus arrived, North America was a vibrant land filled with diverse cultures, languages, and traditions. Today, the United States is home to hundreds of nations, each with its own society, governance, and intricate ways of living. From the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast, known for its sophisticated political systems, to the Navajo and Apache tribes in the Southwest, each group adapted uniquely to its environment, creating some of the world's most innovative societies. Most of us learned in school about Native Americans as if they were one homogeneous group, which is far from reality. Each nation had unique beliefs, clothing, languages, and government systems. These were not very primitive societies, as our textbooks portray. Take the Iroquois, for example, whose League of Nations is thought to have influenced the American Constitution. That's right. Democracy in America has native roots, a fact often overshadowed by other founding stories. Let's tackle some of the stereotypes that still exist. How often have we seen Native Americans portrayed in the media as noble savages or wise spiritual guides? These one-dimensional images are so ingrained in popular culture that they distort the reality of who Native Americans were and are. The truth is that each tribe and nation had its way of life, with beliefs and practices that were diverse and dynamic. One stereotype is that Native Americans were all warriors, constantly in conflict with settlers. But Native societies were more about balance, trade, and diplomatic relations than warfare. Many tribes practiced conflict resolution and negotiation long before European settlers arrived, finding ways to live harmoniously with their neighbors. Even when the Europeans arrived and the whole struggle began, Native Americans signed over 400 peace treaties, of which many, unfortunately, were broken by settlers. The Apache, for instance, had complex alliances, both within their communities and with nearby tribes, based on mutual benefit. Another harmful myth is that Native Americans lived off the land, in ways that imply they were passive inhabitants. But they were active shapers of their environment. from controlled burns to managing the forests to creating intricate irrigation systems. Many native societies deeply understood agriculture and ecology. They didn't just take from the land, they nurtured it, promoting biodiversity and sustainability. Some fruits and vegetables we eat today, like tomatoes, corn, and potatoes, are thanks to indigenous agricultural practices. The arrival of European settlers wasn't just a peaceful exchange of ideas and goods. It was an invasion that led to widespread suffering for native population. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza were devastating, wiping out up to 90% of indigenous people in some areas within a few decades. This tragic loss wasn't accidental. In many cases, these diseases were weaponized through practices like gifting infected blankets. But the cost wasn't only in lives. Colonization disrupted entire ways of life. Traditional lands were taken, and with them, the cultural practices tied to those lands. Forced off their lands and onto reservations, Native Americans saw their hunting grounds, farmlands, and sacred sites destroyed. Many indigenous communities faced relocation policies that separated them from their traditional territories and resources, leaving them dependent on the U.S. government. One example is the Cherokee Trail of Tears, a forced march that led to the death of thousands. This was not an isolated incident. The policies aimed to displace native communities and ultimately civilize them by erasing their languages, spiritual practices, and customs. These actions left scars that are still felt by Native Americans today, who continue to fight for recognition, land rights, and respect for their cultural heritage. One of the most heartbreaking chapters in Native American history is the boarding school era taught. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Native American children were taken from their families, sometimes forcibly, and placed in government-run or church-operated boarding schools. The goal was to kill the Indian, save the man, to strip children of their culture, language, and identity, turning them into what they called proper American. These schools were often far from home, isolating children from their families and communities. They were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their customs, or wearing traditional clothes. Children were forced to cut their hair, change their names, and endure grueling punishments for any act of cultural expression. The trauma from this era is still deeply felt by indigenous communities, as many survivors and their descendants deal with the psychological impact of cultural loss and identity suppression. In recent years, graves of Native children have been found on the sites of former boarding schools, shedding light on the abuse and neglect many endure. The effects of this era are still seen today, with high rates of mental health issues, substance abuse, and family separations within Native communities. However, indigenous people are resilient, working to reclaim and revitalize their cultures, languages, and traditions that boarding schools sought to erase. We often consider the American Revolution a battle for freedom against British oppression. But for many Native American tribes, it was a period of deep uncertainty and danger. The British and American colonists sought alliances with Native groups, offering promises of protection or rewards. Ultimately, the Native nations saw little benefit, regardless of whose side they took. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for instance, was split during the Revolution, with some nations siding with the British and others with the Americans. This internal division was painful and left lasting effects on these communities. Both sides used Native Americans as pawns in their struggle, often making promises they had no intention of keeping. When the dust settled, it was Native communities that paid the price, with land seizures and betrayals that intensified after the war. While the American colonies gained their freedom, Native nations faced increased encroachment on their lands and sovereignty. The new United States government didn't honor the alliances it had made with Native groups. viewing them as obstacles to expansion. This marked the beginning of a long series of broken treaties that systematically undermined native rights. Thanksgiving is a cherished American holiday, symbolizing peace and gratitude. But the story behind it is far more complex. The traditional narrative we're taught of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a friendly feast doesn't capture the full story. The Wampanoag people helped the pilgrims survive their first winter, providing them with food and teaching them how to farm in their new environment. However, this act of goodwill was not the beginning of a harmonious relationship. The peace was short-lived as tensions rose with the growing number of settlers, leading to violent conflicts. Decades after the first Thanksgiving, wars like King Philip's War saw violent clashes between native tribes and settlers, ending with the near destruction of the Wampanoag people. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving is not a celebration, but a reminder of loss and betrayal. While families across the country gather to give thanks, Indigenous people honor a national day of mourning to remember their ancestors and the resilience of their cultures. Today, many of the stereotypes about Native Americans persist in popular culture. They're often portrayed as stoic or spiritual, reducing them to one-dimensional characters. Think of Halloween costumes depicting native clothing or mascots that mock native imagery. These stereotypes may seem harmless, but they fuel misunderstandings and minimize native identities. For instance, the noble savage trope paints Native Americans as somehow purer or closer to nature. Still, this image is another way to keep them in the past. It's a stereotype that ignores the vibrant modern lives of Native people today. Native Americans are doctors, lawyers, artists, and scientists. Active societal participants, not relics of a bygone era. Likewise, the mascot issue is more harmful than some realize. Native American mascots are a constant reminder of how Indigenous people are often treated as caricatures, rather than real individuals with a rich history and evolving culture. These mascots reinforce outdated, often harmful ideas that trivialize Native identities. Even though some people argue that these mascots honor Native Americans, the reality is that they perpetuate stereotypes, making it difficult for people to see Indigenous cultures in their true complex forms. However, these stereotypes and misconceptions extend beyond mascots and Halloween costumes. There are also deep-seated misconceptions about Native American communities today. Many people think of reservations as impoverished, desolate places without understanding the resilience and strength of Native nations. While it's true that systemic challenges have made life difficult for many, it's equally true that Native communities are vibrant and adaptive. They're working to rebuild what colonization tried to destroy, keeping their languages alive, preserving their traditions, and advocating for sovereignty. For many of us, Disney's Pocahontas was an early introduction to Native American culture. However, the animated story needs to reflect true history. The real Pocahontas was a young girl named Amanute, part of the Powhatan Confederacy in what is now Virginia. At around 10 or 11 years old, she encountered the English colonist John Smith. Still, contrary to popular legend, they had no romantic relationship. The actual events were far darker. The English later captured Pocahontas, held her for ransom, and married off to John Rolfe, a tobacco plant. She was later taken to England, paraded around as a symbol of uncivilized Native Americans, and ultimately died there at the age of 21. Her story is not a tale of love bridging cultures, but one of exploitation and manipulation. She was used as a tool to promote the colonization of indigenous lands, a fact rarely discussed in history classes. The real Pocahontas was a girl caught between worlds, facing pressure from her people and from the colonists who sought to use her as a political pawn. Her story, like that of many Native American women, has been romanticized, overshadowing the grim reality of colonization and the personal struggles she endured. Acknowledging her true story reminds us that Native women were not just passive characters in history, but resilient, resisting in ways that history books often ignore. One of the most misunderstood aspects of modern Native American issues is the land back movement. Many people assume it's about returning all land in North America to indigenous peoples, but the concept goes beyond simple ownership. The land back movement advocates for recognizing indigenous sovereignty, cultural revitalization, and environmental stewardship. For indigenous people, land is not just a physical space. It's a living part of their identity, culture, and spirituality. Centuries of forced relocation and broken treaties separated Native communities from these lands. Still, today, tribes are fighting for the right to manage and protect them. The land back movement is about restoring these relationships, giving Native people a voice in how lands are used, and allowing them to maintain their cultural practices without interference. An example is the Black Hills in South Dakota, which the Lakota Sioux consider sacred. This land was promised to them in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, only to be seized after gold was discovered there. The Lakota people continue to seek control over the Black Hills, not only as a matter of justice, but also as a means of preserving their culture and spirituality. For many Native groups, the land back movement represents a path to healing, reconnection, and the reestablishment of sovereignty. Another thing your teacher probably didn't tell you is that some Native American tribes have always been environmental activists. The connection between Native cultures and the land goes far beyond spiritual beliefs. It's based on sustainable practices and respect for natural resources. Many indigenous people consider themselves stewards of the land, believing their role is to protect and preserve it for future generations. In recent years, Native groups have been at the forefront of environmental movements, from protesting oil pipelines like the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock to advocating for policies that address climate change. These movements are not only about protecting native lands, but also about safeguarding the planet. Indigenous knowledge of sustainable practices, developed over thousands of years, offers valuable insights into conservation and environmental protection. The 2016 Standing Rock protests are a powerful example. Thousands of indigenous people and their allies gathered to oppose the construction of an oil pipeline that threatened the Missouri River, a vital water source. The movement wasn't just about stopping a pipeline. It was a stand for indigenous rights, environmental justice, and respect for sacred lands. Although the pipeline was completed, the protests ignited a global conversation about the need to respect indigenous sovereignty and protect the environment. Despite centuries of attempts to erase native identities, indigenous cultures are not only surviving, but thriving. Across North America, Native people are revitalizing their languages, practicing traditional arts, and passing down their customs to younger generations. From powwows that celebrate indigenous heritage to the resurgence of native languages through educational programs, Native communities are fighting to reclaim what was taken from them. Native artists, writers, musicians, and scholars powerfully contribute to contemporary culture. They are breaking stereotypes, showing the world that indigenous people are not relics of the past, but vibrant, dynamic communities that continue to grow and evolve. Authors like Louise Erdrich and Joy Harjo, the first Native American poet laureate, use their words to tell stories of Native resilience and resist. Filmmakers and activists are also making strides, helping to reshape the narrative around indigenous experiences. This cultural renaissance is more than just a revival. It's an assertion of identity and a celebration of survival. By sharing their stories, Native people educate others, break down stereotypes, and ensure that future generations can take pride in their heritage. This resilience is a testament to the strength and endurance of indigenous communities, who have held on to their traditions against unimaginable odds. Native American societies have long valued women's roles, often in ways different from Western cultures. In many tribes, women were central to the community as leaders, healers, and decision-makers. The Haudenosaunee, for instance, are known for their matrilineal society, where women hold significant power in decision-making, including the selection of male leaders. In native traditions, women often played roles as warriors, protectors, and negotiators, responsibilities that were passed down through generations. This reverence for women's roles contrasts sharply with the colonial perception that imposed patriarchal systems on native societies, where the power of women was systematically undermined. Today, Native American women remain leaders in cultural revitalization, activism, and environmental protection. They are at the forefront of movements like Emiwoji and Land Back, championing justice and preserving culture. The narrative that Native Americans are relics of the past is a persistent misconception. Today, Native people are active in every field, from politics to medicine to education and the arts. Native Americans are creating new paths for their communities while preserving their cultures, representing a dynamic presence that challenges the stereotypes often portrayed in popular media. In politics, leaders like Deb Haaland, the first Native American cabinet secretary, are breaking new ground and advocating for Native issues on national platforms. Native entrepreneurs, scientists, educators, and creatives also bring fresh perspectives to their fields. By reclaiming their voices in these spaces, they are bridging the gap between tradition and modernity, demonstrating that indigenous identities are vibrant and evolving. Moreover, Native people are working to reshape the educational system so that future generations understand indigenous history beyond stereotypes. Many are developing resources for schools, sharing accurate depictions of Native American history, culture, and contribution. These efforts are part of a broader push to ensure that Native American experiences and voices are represented accurately and respectfully in all aspects of society. The history of Native Americans is rich with resilience and culture. Still, the version taught in schools often leaves out crucial truths. Ignoring or simplifying these stories, we miss the full picture and allow harmful myths to persist. Native communities today are leaders in environmental and social movements, reminding us that their legacy isn't just history. It's a living force shaping our world. By acknowledging their real stories, we honor a heritage vital to understanding our shared future. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more historical videos about the Native Americans. See you in our next video.